So the truth about Attack on Titan, the story about a colossal titan breaking down a wall and all these weird-looking titans just eating humanity, has its origins in civilizations on the outside, clearly influenced off of historical events in our real world. And so, catching up to Attack on Titan manga myself, guys, I thought that I'd give you guys a top 10 list, specifically a top 10 references to Nazi Germany and Jews, because I don't know if you guys noticed this reading these last 10 chapters of Attack on Titan, but there are so many inspirations from that time period in Attack on Titan, this current arc, the Marleyan arc. In fact, Hajime Isayama, the author of Attack on Titan, in a recent interview admitted that he is inspired off of World War II films when it comes to this Marley arc. And Marley is the most important arc without a doubt in the Attack on Titan story, because we actually talk about the origins of the Titans and the truths behind every single mystery in the story to date. Number 10, armbands being used to discriminate one race from the other. So all Eldians in Marley society within the ghettos have to wear this armband that basically symbolizes their Eldian heritage. It's a means of identifying the population, containing them within the ghettos, and of course it's illegal to take that armband off. So let's say somebody leaves that ghetto, they take it off, well, they're now in trouble, right? The Nazis had Jews wear Stars of David on their arms or, elsewhere on the body so that they can eventually persecute this group of people, right? They did this in order to sort of label them and to visualize them as one thing, and then eventually pass policies that would make it easier to group them all together and have these policies affect the entire population. And in the Attack on Titan world, there's an extra layer stacked on top in the sense that there really is no visual difference between these two groups of people, which is why they actually conduct blood tests to see who's an Eldian and who's a Marleyan. If you strip them both naked, you can't really tell the difference at all. I mean, just take a look at Bertolt and Reiner. They are both Eldians. The same problems did exist in Nazi Germany and surrounding occupied territories, even though, of course, there were racial characteristics that, the government sort of tried to use in order to label one group from the other. Although it was a little different, of course, because they would use names, and they even changed their passports and had additional labels for people of Jewish heritage or people within that community who practiced that faith. Whereas in Marleyan society, when it came to the names, when it came to just about everything else, at the very least, as far as we know, there is no difference. Unless, of course, you actually do a blood test or you transform into a Titan. Number 9, Marley society had anti-miscegenation laws, and basically that prohibits the mixing or sexual acts between Marleyans and the people of Ymir/Eldians. We know this is the case when Reiner's father basically goes off on Reiner and says that he could get into major trouble, possibly even hanged, if the government of Marley finds out that he slept with an Eldian, or Reiner's mother. In fact, Reiner's mom at one point stated that had she been born a Marleyan, Reiner would have been treated like everybody else, and that's because, of course, he was born as an illegitimate child of an illegitimate illegal relationship, one that ultimately forced the wife and the husband, to live completely separate from one another, despite the fact that the father clearly displayed emotions and probably still had feelings for not only his child, but also for his wife, or his, whatever you want to call that broken relationship. I don't know what the hell they had. Number 8, Eldians were segregated in society, and they were forced to form sub-societies, and they were forced to live in ghettos, or these internment zones. And while they weren't necessarily as harsh as concentration camps, it's also important to note that not all concentration camps in World War II were as harsh as each other. Some were a lot less harsh than others. Some were extremely extreme and were simply used for execution and hard labor. In fact, if you want to draw another World War II parallel, you could compare this to the Japanese people in the United States at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, being interned in camps as well. While the Liberia ghettos were nowhere near as harsh and cruel as a lot of the ghettos that existed in World War II, it's still safe to say that it was completely messed up, and isolating an entire population based off of who they are is, extremely reminiscent of what happened during Nazi Germany. In fact, you could even argue that if Eldians could not be used as tools, could not be used as weapons in war, there would be a segment, and a growing segment, of the population in Marley that would call more and more for the extinction of all Eldians, because they view them as threats that can turn into Titans. In fact, this point was brought up by Zeke Yeager, one of Marley's most powerful Eldian tools, at a conference with Porco and Reiner, of course, as they were talking about the future of the Eldian race and Marley society as a whole. And it's important to note that because of these high levels of overt discrimination, people even within Marley looking down on the Eldians, them having no form of currency, them not really having any economic power, means that at any point in time they could be subject to the harshest of treatments, and because they're poor, nobody would really care. And that's kind of similar to what happened to poor Jews that, were living in occupied areas of Nazi Germany. In fact, the PSA guards can do whatever they want without any consequence, which is why Grisha's sister was fed to dogs, ultimately. I mean, how cruel and disgusting is that? And that's one of the things that ultimately led to the LDR restoration movement, this resistance movement. Number 7, heavy propaganda. If there's one thing Marley society has done well, it's convince their subjects of Ymir, their Eldians, that every single other Eldian outside of their society is evil and needs to be exterminated, and until they do that, they won't be free. That's some heavy propaganda. Well, the same types of propaganda that the Marley government has kind of fed to its society, to its people, to demonize one group, is very similar to the types of propaganda Nazi Germany also fed their own people about the Jews and other groups as well. Instead of looking at the history of Marley as an objective power struggle, they revised the history to make all these Eldians look to be like these ruthless killers that are out to get everybody. In fact, this propaganda is so strong that Marley effectively destroyed the reputation of Eldians. So it was already bad, period, right? But in other countries, they hate them even more than they hate them now in Marley, because Marley would deploy the Eldians as these tools to basically kill people in the other societies. Which is why at the conference, one of the number one topics brought up is like, yo, we gotta keep Marley in power, otherwise when other countries take over, they won't even be using us as tools, as weapons, because they don't need to, right? They have their own weapons. They're just gonna get rid of us. In fact, because of the last couple Titan chapters focusing on Reiner, you see just how much the propaganda got to him. And I mean, of course, we've seen past examples with like Zeke selling out his own family, being this double agent, right? But Reiner himself constantly threatened to sell out other members of his race to just prove his loyalty to Marley. Like, oh, you must be an Eldian spy, I'm gonna report you. This is something that's been said by Reiner to multiple people multiple times. Same thing happened in World War II. Jews would sell out other Jews to prove their loyalty or just to survive, period. And, when there was an influx of immigration from, Eastern Europe into other countries, there was also problems between different Jewish groups. And, there was this fear, of course, that Jews from other countries were trying to take over societies. And basically, the same kinds of things you see with the Eldians and Marley society. The Marleyans just completely fear the Eldians, despite the fact that the majority of Eldians really have no ill intent at all. Number 6, honorary Marleyans. So you heard that right. In Marley society, an Eldian can move up in the ranks and acquire more rights in society. If an Eldian proves himself loyal and useful enough to achieve this status, he can start acquiring more rights, like traveling around where he wants, meeting up with high-ranking officials in Marley society, and he pretty much becomes one with Marley. In fact, we don't know all the details, but I'd be willing to bet that some of the laws, for instance, like the anti-miscegenation laws that exist in the society where you can't sleep with a Marleyan, they start to go away. I say this because in some extreme cases, like with the Tibber family, they literally run Marleyan society. They can get whatever they want, literally, right? And the reason, of course, they achieved this status is because in this great war that happened hundreds of years ago, they tipped the war in Marleyan favor, and that's the reason Marley exists the way it does and is as powerful as it is today. In Nazi Germany, you could become an honorary Aryan. So if you weren't an Aryan, which is basically what the Germans used to consider somebody really like German, which, by the way, doesn't really have any scientific basis for it, but you could just sum it down to you look kind of German, right? You have lighter hair, possibly blue eyes, green eyes, something of that sort, the facial characteristics that they want you to have. Even if you aren't biologically Aryan, you could still become an honorary Aryan. This applied to Japanese people for political reasons because the Japanese were allied with Nazi Germans during the war. This applied to Finnish people as well for political reasons, even if they weren't considered Nordic, quote-unquote, by some Nazi eugenicists, even though Finns are more Nordic than Germans. At the end of the day, they still consider them honorary Aryans because there was a war between Finland and the Soviet Union, and the Nazi Germans, or Nazi Germany, had a very anti-Soviet Union policy. So they considered their, the enemy of their enemy, their friend. In some extreme cases, you had your Reiner Brauns in Nazi Germany, these mixed blood people like Erhard Milch, who was very high up in the army, specifically the Air Force, where he even had a close relationship with those in Hitler's circle. So you could, in rare cases, acquire high rank if you are, of course, useful enough to the society. Number 5, aggressive foreign policy exacerbated the bad treatment of the Eldians in Marley society and the Jews in Nazi Germany. As more and more time went on and the Eldians were used more and more as tools dropped down from the sky only to eat an entire civilian population, Marley effectively destroyed the Eldian reputation to the point to where other societies hated the Eldians to where they wanted them exterminated. So high up Eldians are like, okay, we need to keep Marley in power. In Nazi Germany before the war, there was overt discrimination. There were laws, anti-Jewish laws, and there were, extreme abuses, but nothing like what happened until after the war started, and Germany was fighting a war they simply could not win, and this forced a lot of the higher-ups and the Nazi Party to make a lot of extreme and irrational decisions, on top of the fact that they were already irrational, of course. So a lot of the questions, like the final solution, what are we going to do with the Jews of Europe, these questions were not addressed in their entirety until the war started, and they had to address them in a way, whereas before they kind of toyed around with certain policies, but there was nothing that extreme. Similar to the Eldians' treatment as the war continues, as Marley colonizes more and more land. So you could say for different reasons, but the end result is terrible treatment for both groups of people. Although at the same time, if the Eldians were not used as weapons, it could end up being a very similar situation, a more similar situation to the Jews in Nazi Germany, because they don't have this power, and because their power at the very least is useless and they can't be used as weapons, they're now easily disposed of. Number 4, Eldian Marleyans felt Marleyan, alright? They did not feel Eldian, they completely despised the Eldians outside of Marley on Paradise Island, of course, and they wanted them gone. That propaganda hit them hard, and that's a very important point to make when Reiner's family are eating dinner and Reiner's telling stories about these evil Eldians when he knows he's just talking out his ass and he really has nothing to say or nothing to really show. In fact, that's why Gabby noticed the bluff and even asked him later on, can you tell me what you're hiding? Zeke Yeager sold out his own parents for Marley. The warriors of Marley want Marley's dominance to not only ensure the safety of the Marleyan people, but also their own people living within Marley. They truly feel Marleyan. And the same thing could be said about many German Jews. For those who don't actually know, German Jews were a lot more integrated in Germany than many other Jewish populations in other surrounding countries in Europe. Many of them were married to non-Jews, did not practice the religion at all. They birthed many kinds of progressive movements. They had really great jobs. In fact, at one point in time, they had many people in a leading political party in Germany that could have, decided Germany's future in a completely different direction. Not every German Jew was granted this privilege, of course, but some were, and some truly felt German. A lot of them won different kinds of awards in World War I. Now, when the Nazis took over, they basically didn't care about none of that. If you were a Jew, you were a Jew, and we were getting rid of you. The Tibber family. Rich Jews oftentimes were exempt from the ill treatment that affected the poor Jews and the ones that couldn't get away from the active, terrible policies that affected them. It is literally confirmed in a conversation between Big Dick Willie Tibber and Maggot, the general of the military forces in Marley, that the Tibber family is the true ruling body of the Marley nation behind the scenes. And while there weren't Jews with that kind of influence in Nazi Germany, there were Jews who were completely exempt from the ill treatment of the Nazis simply because they were the fortunate ones of the bunch. They had the wealth, the resources, the influence to get away before all these crazy things started to happen. The Tibber family has been completely exempt from any kind of political decisions, from any kind of war, whereas poor Eldians are constantly recruited as cannon fodder and eventually develop PTSD or just simply die because they're killed on the front lines. They are completely exempt from all of that. In fact, they have not used their Warhammer Titan power yet. And if you know anything about Marley society, is that they only view Eldians as tools, pretty much, as resources, because of their Titan powers. So the fact that this family has one of the most powerful Titan powers, and they ain't even gotta use it, and they're the true ruling body, man, oh man, are they lucky off as Eldians. The Rothschilds family took some losses in terms of wealth, some of the branches within Europe, but at the end of the day, they pretty much all got away and none of them were really affected by any of the negative policies. Number 2, anti-Semitism was a rule in many nations at the time, both in Attack on Titan and Marley society and around the world, and also, of course, with the Jews in Nazi Germany and surrounding European countries, America, just all around the world in general. There was recently a conference hosted by Zeke where he basically said that he should try to get the Tibber family to host this international event, and in this international event, we've got Willie the speaker basically confirming everybody's doubts, and that's the fact that maybe there's some general, rational people in other parts of the world. No, they just all want the Eldians gone. They want them exterminated. Now, I think it's a little bit different when it comes to the Eldians because they could turn into Titans and eat you, so there's, an extra layer of fear stacked on top, but of course, that's not what's important. It's actual intentions that count. And it's very interesting because the black people in Attack on Titan, the first couple black people that were introduced, they also seem to be on board with Eldian extermination, whereas in the real world, of course, black people are often affected by the same kinds of racial abuse that Jews were historically also objected to. It started off as legends with the Jews as well, and, everybody knows about, like, the Middle Eastern, Jesus being, hung on the cross, and all these kinds of old religious stories. It started from there, and then it branched off into other kinds of discriminations. Same thing with the Eldians. It started off in Marley, and then Marley just effectively destroyed their reputation. Number 1, extremely unusually harsh punishment for very stupid things. Now, in Nazi Germany, a joke about Hitler can get you executed. This actually happened, by the way, with a woman in Nazi Germany at the time. She made a joke about Hitler, a pretty harsh joke about Hitler, and she was actually killed, I believe. Well, same thing in this society, Marleyan society. Not only can your sister be eaten by dogs, and you really can't complain at all if you're a poor Eldian, but you could be hanged for sleeping with another race. That being said, guys, I hope y'all enjoyed this top 10. There's probably more examples to go around. This was only a top 10, and of course, Nazi Germany is not the only historical time period referenced to an Attack on Titan. There's actually quite a few, though you're just completely ignorant to think that this entire arc and even the origin story of Attack on Titan isn't clearly just directly referenced to Nazi Germany.